So we're in 2 Samuel 15, and they're the prophet, actually a little bit before that. The prophet Nathan, he's made a prediction about the king, David's life, that the sword is never going to depart from his house. Now, of course, that's a result of his sin with Bathsheba, we found in chapter 12, verse 10. Well, the rape of Tamar and the subsequent murder of Amnon are really only the first installments of this punishment that's breathed out for him, this divine edict. The sword, David, will never depart from your house. Well, in David's last years, he's going to face not one, but two political rebellions, and of all people, led by his sons from his own house, just like God promised. There will also be a revolt by a Benjamite that we'll cover, but two of those three are going to come from within his own house. From the moment that Absalom set foot on Israelite soil, he has been plotting, it seems, to overthrow his father, David, and so he can become the king. The handsome devil, some have called. I like that, don't you? I don't like what he does, but I love that terminology. That is so true, the handsome devil. Oh, this guy, he's sly in his plottings. He utilizes several tactics that are not unfamiliar territory to you and me. That we know another devil as well that utilizes them. Satan still uses many of these same ploys against us today, and I think that's why our study is going to be so helpful. We better understand what takes place with Absalom and his attempt to take over the kingdom of Israel. We can better understand how Satan's working in our lives to try to overthrow the hold that the king has on us. He wants to get kingdom citizens to join his rebellion against heaven's king. And that's exactly what the handsome devil is going to be doing in our passage tonight. So I've advertised to you, and I want to make good on it. We're in chapter 15, and we're going to start reading, of course, in verse number 1. After this had happened, that Absalom, time out. It seems like we get a lot of that to start these chapters. After this, or following, or, while... Okay, well, we have to be reminded. It's been 2 weeks, and we're not going to go too far back, but look back in the end of chapter 14, and who can just briefly state, what was 14 about? What happened in chapter 14? Remember the rape of Tamar, that's already in the past. Amnon, he dies. Absalom takes revenge. That's already in the past. That's not 14. What was the most recent thing in 14? After Absalom kills his partial brother, Amnon, what does he do? Where does he go? Grandpa, when you get in trouble, where do you go, right? We might not have that privilege anymore, but I can guarantee you, I always went, well, not as much to Grandpa, but a little bit more to Grandma, no offense to our grandpas. But yeah, he goes to grandparents, right? And so he's been staying, of course, in Jerusalem with the royal family. He goes way up tens of miles up to the northeast to Geshur, and yeah, that's where Grandpa has his own kingdom. And he's committed murder really down here in Jerusalem, and he runs away and he finds some asylum with Grandpa for how long? Does anybody recall? 3 years. You may have mentioned. I'm sorry if you did. So for 3 years he goes up there and stays. Well, eventually there's some coaxing with the king, and he actually ends up inviting Absalom to come back home. And so Absalom goes from palace up to the northeast, and he comes and he stays in palace of the southwest, right? Not exactly. He comes back southwest, but where does Daddy say you're going to be staying? Okay. Probably so. Yeah, there you go. Very good, Kyle. So he says, you're not staying in the castle with us, not in the palace. So he allows him to come back home, but it doesn't seem like maybe he's fully forgiven him, or maybe he has really down deep, but he thinks it's not going to be a good appearance if I bring him back. It looks like I'm going to be poo-pooing murder, is what he may be thinking. One way or another, though, he doesn't let him come stay in the castle. You have to go stay in your own house. So don't forget that it's been 5 years since father and son have even seen one another's faces, much less spoken. They haven't even seen one another for half a decade. All right, so I say that to come back to our verse. After this, that's a very short prepositional phrase with a lot of meaning. After everything that's transpired over the last 5 years, it happened that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. Of what does this remind you? I have something in mind. It's probably way different but it may not be. Of what does this remind you? There's no right or wrong answer here. I'm just curious. You got horses running and chariots and 50 men running around whenever this guy comes through town. It reminds me of and I know I'm going to say it, okay? The Dixie Stampede. It's ridiculous, okay? It's the Dixie Stampede. Anyway, the Stampede, as it's called now in our PC society. But doesn't that, have you seen that before? And you got the horses running and all the riders on them, and I don't remember if they're chariots. There are all kinds of crazy stuff, and horses jumping through fire rings, and people just running. I mean, it's the most entertaining thing. And this is it, though. It catches your attention whenever Absalom comes strolling through town. We don't have a lot of evidence that royal families in Israel have been running these horses and putting on a big show, and I think for good reason. The horses have been a connection to what territory? Goes back several hundred years. Yeah, not good memories, okay, back there. And so God had some special rules about horses, and I think that's probably some of it. Don't trust in your horses, don't multiply your horses, don't trust in your chariots, don't multiply your chariots, and those kinds of things. And so you don't see Israelite kings really being that involved with these. And this guy's not a king, right? But he's getting involved with them. And that might give some indication as to where his mind's going. Wherever he goes, he puts on a show through the kingdom. Remember, he's been restored now back to the royal family. He's been forgiven, okay, or so maybe it would seem. And so he has access to all these royal amenities, and boy, does he show it when he travels through the kingdom. Verse 2, now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. The gate's where everyone's going to be coming into town to do business transactions, and especially if they need to talk to the king or those in the household. And so why do you think this guy would stand out, get up really early in the morning, and he'd stand out there at the gate? Why do you think he'd do that? Okay, good. He's going to get noticed, isn't he, Paul, whenever he's out there? And it may just be one of these things, getting familiar with all the subjects really well, probably even start calling them by name and asking them how their days are going, what's happening in their lives. Makes a real impression. So it was whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision that Absalom would call to him and say, hey, what city are you from? And he would say, oh, you're servants from such and such a tribe of Israel. I think he's striking up conversation with these guys. So it's not even just small talk. I mean, like really getting to know these people and from where they come and what their business is and coming to the royal city. Verse 3, then Absalom would say to him, look, your case is good and right, but there is no deputy of the king to hear you. In other words, whenever a person has a complaint, they say there's some injustice, and so they're coming to the king to get this decided. He listens to what their case is, and every time he tells every one of them, you're right. The ruling ought to be in your favor. Now, do you think there ever might be a case or two where someone actually isn't right in the claim that they're making? If so, Absalom doesn't tell them that. He says, you are right. I think this guy is gone, I know, but he needs to open a business in 21st century America. The customer's right, always right? We're losing that more, it seems like, in our society. Well, he says, for anyone who brings a legal case, you're right. And so, people like to hear that, even if maybe they're not right. He's not done. Verse 4, moreover, Absalom would say, oh, that I were made judge in the land. It's a shame that the king doesn't have any mediator here to help you travel from how far away? That shouldn't happen. Well, if there was somebody else in place, this situation could be fixed. You know what? I think I could help out with this. If I were a judge, you wouldn't have to travel so far. You wouldn't have to burden the king. And also we know from history that kings are so busy and they get to them somewhat menial case brought before them. They don't want to listen. They don't want to deal with it. Okay? And so maybe that's what he has in mind. Oh, that I were made a judge in the land, and everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me. then I would give him justice. It would be official. I'd just give you the ruling right then and there. It'd be done. It'd be exactly what you want every time, guaranteed. That sounds good. And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand. Okay, time out. Why would anyone come to Absalom and then bow down before him? That's kind of pompous. Oh, he's king designate. Let's not forget, all right? Yeah, this guy is a prince of the king, and also he's a king in waiting. And I think that's a big reason why some people wanted to get Absalom back home, because they already are thinking, hey, David's getting up there in years, and once he's gone, we've groomed this guy to be our next king, but if he's in exile and something happens to David, he might not be our next king. And so, yeah, they look at him as the king in waiting, maybe kind of a number 2 in the kingdom. So just like they'd treat the king himself, when they come into the presence of Absalom, they'd bow down to the ground. But here's what we're told the reaction of this young man, relatively speaking, was. Whenever anyone would come near to bow down to him, he would put out his hand. What do you think is meant by that? So they're coming down, bow down before, and he put out his hand. Maybe this will help. And take him. Help any? No? Yeah? And kiss him. Okay, I don't have anything else. That's all. What do you think is going on here? Very good. Very good. Ordinary behavior of royalty is when you're being respected like this, you kind of just, sit back and stand back. You enjoy it. The way people are treated. Not this guy. As soon as it starts, he reaches out to get a hold of the person or people, and he would bring them up. And what do you think would be meant by take them? I think so. It sounds like he'd embrace him and then kiss also the person. I know that grosses us out, but we know this is culture. And, these people, I've said it many times, in the Bible, people shook hands back then. All right, that's like a really formal way of doing things. Who do you think would take and embrace each other and kiss each other? Okay, yeah, friends and probably family members. We still talk about my great-grandmother, Grandma Mary kisses. Okay, she would, when she'd see you, she'd plant one on you and you'd be wiping it off for days. All right, she loved her slobbers. But it was necessary to get to the ice-cold Pepsis in her fridge. She would always give you, but you'd have to take a grandma, and she'd make each grandkid take one from her. I think it was worth it. There was some really good Pepsis on hot summer days. So, but yeah, we usually, the people that we hug and we kiss, that's either, the closest of friends, family members, or maybe even those that are closer than family. Of course, he doesn't hardly know these people, but think about how he's treating them. He is royalty. And he's in there among the people in their daily business and what it is that they have going on, meets them early on. He puts on a show whenever he comes to town. He talks to everyone about the legal complaints, and he says, "You're right. You know what? If I were a judge, I'd say yes right now. You wouldn't even need to talk to the king, and it would all be over." And people try to come before him and honor him, and he picks them up, and he hugs them and kisses them. No, what he's telling him is, I'm not any better than you. We're on the same plane as each other. Man, this guy would make a politician today, wouldn't he? He's got it all figured out, or so it seems. If only he were the real deal through and through. We're going to find out, though, he has some ulterior motives in this business. Who'd like to state our memory verse, number 6 of 2 Samuel 15, verse 6. I'll say this one. In this manner, Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. I ask you to consider for just a moment. I'm telling you, there's some real parallels that can be drawn here in the tactics this guy uses. Essentially, here's what he's trying to do. He's attempting to get the subjects of the kingdom to give up their loyal king. Of course, David's had some pretty big mistakes. recently, and he's taken advantage of his subjects, and that's another conversation. But for the most part, for decades now, this king has been loyal to his country, and Absalom, the son, is trying to get the people to switch their allegiance from David, by essentially telling them, you can't trust this guy. He's not looking out for your best good. He's not listening to you. What you need is somebody like me. And I'd be your friend forever. I'd do everything that you want. I'd give you everything that you would ever desire. If you just listen to me and do what I say, everything will be fine. And he tries to get to these people through flattery and deceit, but especially he tries to get them to turn their hearts against their king. And he's very successful in that effort. You can't trust him anymore. Put your reliance in me. Now, does that sound familiar at all? Back in the garden, Genesis chapter 3, there's a creature that's more subtle than any other. And he comes to the lady and he asks her a question about her king and whether the king really has her best interests in heart. And he says, you can't trust him. Here's what's really going on. What you need is a friend like me. Someone who cares about you. I'll give you everything you ever wanted. All you need to do is listen to me and follow me as ruler of your life, and not this guy. You can't trust him. Now, we've recently had these lessons on Sundays, and it's the New Testament that tells us in 1 Timothy chapter 2, the man was not deceived, but the woman, being deceived, fell into transgression. How did Satan win over the subjects of heaven's kingdom? But through trickery and deceit, and especially the tactic of you can't trust him, you can only trust me. He turned the hearts away from the king so that a new king could be in charge of the lady's life and as well the man's life. Now, you look back at this is exactly what this guy does. And I really like that terminology of the handsome devil, because he's a devil just like Genesis chapter 3. But this guy, he's so good looking. Remember, there's no blemish in him from head to toe, and he's just so smooth. And everybody just wants to trust him, including Israel's king, Daddy, David. He's given in, hook, line, and sinker. As we've noticed several times in the aging king's life now, he never even sees it coming. Verse 7. Now it came to pass after 40 years. You have another number of years there? I think that's probably more accurate. Every now and then there will be a slight textual variation. 40 years doesn't really make a lot of sense. Why? David should be dead by now, if that's the case. It doesn't, does it? Yeah. He rules for 40 years, okay? So, yeah, I would think probably the textual variant there of 4 is probably a little bit more accurate. But it came to pass after 4 years, more likely. So this goes on for a while. I mean, it's not overnight. The handsome devil, he's smart in the way he goes about things, winning over the people. He says to the king, please let me go to Hebron and pay the vow which I made to the Lord. For your servant took a vow. If you're thinking, what vow? Well, we don't know, and I don't think David does either, until Absalom explains it here. For your servant took a vow while I dwelt at Geshur in Syria. Remember, that's way up in the northeast with Grandpa for 3 years. Saying, if indeed the Lord brings me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. The king said to him, great, go in peace. He thinks he can take him at his word here, and he's being genuine. And let's be honest, I mean, Absalom's had some rough spiritual moments over the last several years. And if your son, as a father, comes to you and says, Dad, look, I'm tired of the life out here. I want to get things back on the straight and narrow. I want God to be the focus of my life. And I told him, if you'll get me out of this mess, Lord, then I'm going to... And so I'm sure David's probably excited about this. He thinks, yes, my son's turning back to God. Everything is turning around in my kingdom. Once again, he likes the idea. And so the godly king says to him, yeah, do that, son. Go in peace. So he arose and he went to Hebron. Now remember, he's come back to Jerusalem now. He and the king have been reunited, Dad. And so he travels about, roughly 10 miles to the southwest to go down to Hebron. Verse 10, then Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel. Whoa, wait a minute. This is where things take a drastic turn. It sounded like everyone's so loving and selfless, and it's like, no, this is getting pretty nasty fast, it sounds like. And he said, as soon as you hear the sound, this is Absalom speaking, sending these spies, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom reigns in Hebron. He's in the process of overthrowing, or trying to, his dad as king. All right, just a few things here. Why Absalom, why would he maybe wait for 4 years to then attempt something like this, number one? Number two, Dad's been so kind and forgiving. Why would he attempt something like this? And number three, why would he do it in this place of all towns? All right, so let's start in any order there. Okay. It was all part of the plan, right? Yeah, long game is what this is, all right? It's not the short game. It's not the immediate. And just like Satan, right? He's okay probably if he can't get us in the next 10 minutes, but he's planning for 10 months, and he's planning for 10 years for us down the road. And the handsome devil's doing exactly the same thing. Also, we've seen this with Amnon. How long until he took revenge on him? It was 2 years. He's planning it, I think, all along. But he was waiting until everything's kind of cooled down before he jumps in. Okay, so that's one matter. Dad's been so good to him. How could he turn his back on him? Well, okay. Okay, good point. Doesn't keep people...
Whether that's common knowledge or not, I don't know. It doesn't really say.
Yeah.
I can think that would probably be common.
Could be. And that goes back to Saul and David. How far was it known? How clearly was it ever officially announced anywhere? There's some things we don't know for sure, but good thoughts. Yes, sir.
Even if it wasn't commonly known, Absalom's not going to take the chance. He's going to take action.
Absolutely. Yeah. He's... Yeah, right. Definitely. And we want to be careful, I think, too, to say, well, I kind of assume this purposely. Well, David's been so good and so forgiving to his son. Has he? 3 years he stays away, okay? And from Absalom's perspective with his brother, you could make the case, and we talked about that some. He's probably upset that Dad didn't get justice for his sister. And so from his perspective, he probably felt like I had to take matters into my own hands, and then you run me off and you treat me like an exile for 3 years, and then you send for me and you bring me back home, and you make me a public embarrassment by not being a part of the royal family for 2 years, and I have to burn down your commander's field just to get your attention to have a conversation with you. All right, so there's a lot at play here, and we don't want to overlook. I think there's been some tension there between the two of them for some time. And we know one thing about Absalom. He wants revenge. When he gets it doesn't really matter, but he seems to want revenge. And I think he wants revenge on his dad as well. Okay, any other thoughts as to Hebron? What's the background of Hebron again? We haven't been there for many years. No, not Saul's, but you're right about a king and a connection here.
That's where David was originally.
There we go. Okay, so David was originally made king there, and he ruled there for 7.5 years. And also, if you go back, I found this interesting. Chapter 3, it's mentioned when David was at Hebron, there were children born to him. Guess who one of those is? That's his hometown. Yeah, that's his hometown. So Absalom goes back to his hometown where he's probably most well known and might be most accepted as king. And we also know that these in the south are willing to buck the trend for king whenever others are accepting somebody else. That's what happened with David over them, and Ishbosheth came in on the north for a while. So it makes some sense why this place would be selected. Absalom, he goes down there, and he tells them, hey, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet and throughout all Israel, shout, Absalom reigns in Hebron. And Absalom went with 200 men invited from Jerusalem. These poor guys, they went along innocently. They didn't have a clue what was going on, that he's trying to overthrow the king who's in place. Then Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from his city, from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy grew strong, for the people with Absalom continually increased in number. Now a messenger came to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. Now remember, it's one thing if you do something and you know it's wrong, you don't intend to continue with it. But when your whole heart has changed over to something, that's a serious matter. And like we pointed out about, and the deception that took place in the garden, it's not just, oh, okay, that's wrong, and then I'll quit. No, it's I feel like I can't trust you anymore, and that's an issue. Same thing here. A lot of them, they feel like they can't trust David anymore because of these lies that have been fed to them over the last 4 years by Absalom. So David said to his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. You can't trust this kid. It's almost like dad has some experience with his boy. That's sad, isn't it? So in verse 15, the king's servants said to the king, we are your servants, ready to do whatever my lord, the king, commands. Then the king went out with all his household after him, but the king left 10 women, concubines, to keep the house. Well, that's awfully thoughtful, isn't it? He's scared to death for his life and all the men's lives, so they get up and they get out of there. They leave 10 women behind so that the house is dusted and the floors are swept whenever they come back home one day. Very, very sweet man. So in verse 17, the king went out with all the people after him and stopped at the outskirts. Then all his servants passed before him, and all the Kerethites, all the Pelethites. Now remember, those are the funny sounding ones, but those are essentially the secret service, the mercenaries, and they appear to have some connection to the Philistines, which would make a lot of sense also, because all the Gittites, those are men from Gath. In case you're wondering about that one, I looked that up to make sure. Those are people of Gath. And then we're told 600 men who had followed him from Gath. And we have a history with those. We know the loyalists who came over, the Philistines, with David. They passed before the king. Then the king said to Ittai, the Gittite, why are you also going with us? Return and remain with the king, for you are a foreigner and also an exile from your own place. That doesn't sound very nice, does it? But you continue on, it actually is a very nice thing. David's looking out for him even though he doesn't have to. How would you like to be this guy? The start of verse 20. In fact, you came only yesterday, which may be a reference to you started this job yesterday. And then today we have a full-blown rebellion. I'm going to have to vacate my ruling city and throne. And, have you ever been that person? You started a job on the wrong day and you come in and you would not believe the mess that's going on. And they're like, normally it's not this bad. Come back tomorrow. And this guy just started the day before. And I think David's looking out for him for that reason. And what he's saying is, hey, listen, don't feel like you have to risk your life and allegiance to me. We haven't spent a lot of time together. You're fine to go free if you want to. I'm not going to compel you to stay on board with me. Should I make you wander up and down with us today since I go, I know not where? I don't even know what's going on or what we're supposed to do. He encourages them. He says, return, take your brethren back. Mercy and truth be with you. But Ittai answered the king and said, as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also your servant will be. I looked up this name, Ittai. I've never heard of it before other than this account. Ittai means with me. How appropriate is that? The guy that stays with him no matter what. Ittai means with me, stays with the king. He says, death or life, you're my king, and I'm not going to leave you behind. So David said to Ittai, go and cross over. Then Ittai the Gittite and all his men and all the little ones who were with him crossed over. And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people crossed over. The king himself, things start to get a little interesting, I think, here. See if any of this sounds familiar to you. The king himself also crossed over. He's left Jerusalem, crossed over the brook Kidron, and all the people crossed over toward the way of the wilderness. There was Zadok also, and if you're wondering who he is, we'll be reminded down in verse 27 that he's a priest. There was Zadok also, and all the Levites, which would be a good clue, with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God, and they set down the ark of God, so they're going to take the ark with them, and Abiathar went up until all the people had finished crossing over from the city. Then the king said to Zadok, carry the ark of God back into the city. I think this is a remark of faith on David's part. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place. I'm not going to try to force God. We know that represents the presence of God. I'm not going to try to force God around with me. But I'm going to separate myself from this peace. And I'm going to trust that God, if he would be so kind and gracious, will bring me and reunite me once again with his presence, with the ark. He will bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place. But if he says thus, this is David speaking about his Lord. If he says thus, I have no delight in you. Here I am, David speaks. Let him do to me as seems good to him. I think he probably understands that he doesn't deserve the graciousness of God in his life, and I think he probably sees, you know what, I probably deserve anything that God would give to me, and if he determines in his perfect wisdom, that's what I've earned, then that's exactly what I want God to give to me. What a humble statement, an understanding and appreciation of the justice of God. Verse 27, the king also said to Zadok, the priest, are you not a seer? Return to the city in peace, and your 2 sons with you. Ahimaaz, your son, and Jonathan, the son of Abiathar. See, I will wait in the plains of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. Therefore, Zadok and Abiathar carried the ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they remained there. So David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives and wept as he went up. And he had his head covered and went barefoot, and all the people who were with him covered their heads up and went up weeping as they went up. All right, so let's pause here for just a moment. Here's what we have. The king of Israel, has been rejected by his own people, or at least a chunk of them, and he has to leave the holy city of God behind. And as he does so, he has to wade through, step over the brook Kidron, and then he takes his loyal followers with him, and he ascends up on the Mount of Olives, and they have a period of worship together. That sound familiar? What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, as soon as you said Kidron, I started looking. It's in John,
18 verse 1. John 18:1.
You already brought it out. Not only to walk basically the same path.
100%.
What is you just said? What does David say? What does he say? God, whatever I deserve. Your will be done, and that's not exactly what Jesus did.
Incredible, isn't it? When he was reviled, did not revile in return, but he committed himself into his hands who judges righteously. Right? It is. I mean, you can't make that up. I'd never thought about this before this study, but I really believe this is intended to be a foreshadowing of Jesus and what he endures. Think about it. He's the king of God's people, rejected by his own, and has to leave behind and walks in the very foot. It's just wild stuff. Really neat. Oh, one thing I didn't mention, by the way, and then I'm going to let you. Also, Hebrews 5, verse 7 later gives us more insight as to those conversations with God with vehement cries and tears. And what do you find the king doing here when he's rejected and he crosses over the Kidron Brook and he goes up the Mount of Olives and he worships God? He's weeping with the people. Anyway, go ahead, Joe.
The only other thing I'll bring out is it's not really comparable to David's story to Jesus, but just the remembering that whenever Jesus stepped over the Kidron, the Passover lambs had already been slaughtered. And where they were slaughtered there at the temple, it emptied into the Kidron. As Jesus stepped over that water, he stepped over the blood of the Passover lambs. I'll never forget whenever I heard a preacher make that point.
Same. Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah. I do know who said it, yeah. Yeah, thanks, Joe. Okay, so let's finish this up really quick. I know there's so much more that can be said on it. I'm sorry, I just wanted to at least bring that much out before we moved on. Verse 31, then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel, that's a hard one for me. Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now it happened when David had come to the top of the mountain, notice where he worshipped God. There was Hushai the Archite coming to meet him with his robe torn and dust on his head. David said to him, if you go on with me, then you will become a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I was your father's servant previously, so I will now also be your servant, then you may defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me. And do you not have Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, with you there? So we can form our own little insight team, and you can keep me informed as to what's going on. Therefore it will be that whatever you hear from the king's house, you shall tell to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Indeed, they have there with them their two sons, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son, and by them you shall send me everything you hear. So Hushai, David's friend, went into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. It's a tough moment in David's life, no doubt, but he's continuing to reap the consequences of the sins that he's committed. I think he's well aware of that, although there is the age-old saying, what doesn't kill you? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think that David's going to become stronger in this for a couple of reasons. And I think it's a good message for us to remember that whenever Satan works so hard to get us to try to switch our allegiance from God to him, and he attacks us in all these different ways in our lives, including in our families, even though it's hard and even though a lot of people turn against us, it's still an encouraging thing to find out those who are in our corner. And if people will stand with you through thick and thin, they will stand with you through anything. And it's also really nice for one's relationship with God. Sometimes when you have to rely more on God and you understand the kind of friend that he is to you, it makes your life better because your relationship between you and your God only grows stronger. And that's what David's going to get to experience in all of this. Okay, any final remarks through chapter 15 and applications that we can make of it? All right, for next time, if you will, please read chapter 16. We're going to read chapter 16, and we're going to see if we can sort this matter out or at least start to make some progress on that. And if you will, please memorize verse 12, 2 Samuel 16:12. A good outlook on God and how he treats us. Okay, anything else? Thank you very much. That's where we'll pick up next week.